Okay, because many of the runners that we work with, and I imagine many of the clients that you have, are in the age categories of being considered a more mature runner, then we want to look at the effects of aging on running performance. So I'll warn you, this story doesn't start very well, but it has a happy ending. Okay, the effects of aging. What happens to runners as they get older? What are the reasons aging runners slow? And we know that all we have to do is look at any age group results, and you'll basically see those 5-year age groups. You know, when I started running years ago, they used 10-year age groups. And they quickly found out that the disparity in 10 years was just too much for those at the upper end of that decade to be competitive. Not in the 30s. 39-year-olds can compete with 30s, but once you get into the 40s, it started to change, and certainly 50s and 60s. So what are the reasons that they're slow? Well, we've already talked about one, and that is that they get injured. That is not unusual, and it's been my observation that runners, particularly somewhere in their 40s, right around mid-40s, will start to experience some kind of injury. And, you know, think about it. It's probably with most of the clients that you have, whether they're tennis players, they're golfers, then tendonitis, elbow problems, shoulder problems for them. Runners started to get Achilles tendonitis or plantar fasciitis. You don't hear about that for 18-year-olds. What is it? And we know that there are certain changes that lead to injury, plus the fact we're just talking about cumulative use over the years. So injury is a concern. And what happens there is you get injured, you miss training time, and you come back and you want to make up for that missed time, and you do even more. You get injured again, now you're in that cycle. And I've seen it so many times. Reduced training volume. We've already talked about the fact that people need recovery, but as you get older, the one thing, I talk to a lot of runners, and I would say those from 50 and older, and I say, tell me about your running. And they describe it, and I say, what's the biggest change? And they say, need more recovery time. So more recovery time probably leads to a reduction in training volume, which is going to affect performance in general. Reduced intensity, and this one is not necessarily something that has to happen, but a lot of runners aren't willing to push themselves to suffer as much as they get older for slower times. So while you keep getting faster, you keep getting motivated to try to get another PR. But once you realize those PRs are in the rearview mirror, then are you going to push yourself and train as hard to do that? Some will, many don't. And many have told me that why should I do that? Psychological factors, and that's what I was talking about. You get depressed, you're not running as fast. Some people accept that, some have troubles with it. Physiological factors, I'm going to go over a lot of those. I'm sorry, but there's a pretty long list. And then there's cultural factors. And this has been interesting for me to observe. I think some of the things that happens is that for many people, their running partners are no longer running. They've been injured, or they've taken up golf. They're doing something else. For others, it's maybe, once you get think about it. People from 45 to about 60 are at the peak of their professional careers. So now they have more responsibilities. They're working longer hours. Maybe they're doing more traveling. And so training just isn't as high on the priority list. So they don't have the training to run as fast. For some, it's that they have children who are involved in a gazillion activities, and they're running from place to place and taking them on travel sport trips on the weekends, so that interferes. Or maybe even grandchildren. So there are a lot of cultural factors that start making it a little more difficult to train. I'm going to read this because you got to understand that the slow, progressive, structural, and functional changes that take place at the cellular, tissue, and organ levels ultimately affecting the performance of all body systems. It is intrinsic, it's irreversible, even though there's some ads for things that you're to purchase for $19.95, that'll reverse it. And it's universal. It's all of us. But it's all body systems. Bortz and Bortz, a famous MD researchers out at Stanford, have looked at biomarkers, all systems of the body, and they find this steady decline, whether we're talking about the brain, all the kidneys, liver, etc., that there is this decline in functioning. And as I said, we know that it is intrinsic to individuals. So there are these physical changes that occur with aging. They're physiological, biochemical, muscular, cardiorespiratory systems are all affected. Some where we actually totally lose the function. Reproduction, high frequency hearing. There's structural changes like fast twitch fibers that we lose, skeletal muscle size, and that is a huge challenge, maintaining muscle size. And some reduced efficiency. The decreased nerve conduction velocity, reaction time. We're just not quite as quick. Older people, whether it's they're driving, and that starts at a certain age, that we just can't react as quickly and respond as quickly. Try going out on a basketball court at age 40 or 50 and guard a 15-year-old. You think, what happened? How did they get around me? So physiological factors. We start to lose lean muscle mass. This starts occurring really by age 30. And so that's why we put such an emphasis on strength training. And it's important to do that. And while we talk about, strength training for runners, we probably need to, do a little bit more in terms of the weights themselves, some heavier weights in order to maintain that muscle mass. Body fat increases, and this is something that we have to work at. But there's no reason that we have this steady increase in body fat. And a lot of that is a cultural problem. And we know in our society it's very difficult, and it's almost accepted that you're going to get heavier and fatter. But there's really no reason not to be like you were when you graduated from high school or college in terms of maintaining weight and keeping that body fat down. You have to work at it. Cardiac output goes down, metabolic rate is not as high, so eating habits have to change. And hormone levels, of course, are decreased. Linear loss from age 30 to 65, uptake decreases approximately 10% per decade. Now, what we found is with training, you can change that typical 1% reduction per year to a 0.5%. And that's the strong message today, is that yes, this is all inevitable that you're going to have this decline and loss, but you can minimize it with training. You can minimize it with good lifestyle habits. We find that the folks who come for our retreats often don't quite understand that until we sit down with them. And Scott and I sit down with every one of them for a half an hour, one-on-one, and talk about what they can do to best improve. And we're pretty frank with them and say, look, your goals are this, but you're undermining it, with your dietary habits, and you really need to be really fit, not just cardiorespiratory, but to be really fit. Then we need you to be stronger, and we need for you to be leaner. It's just a problem in our society, I'm sure you're well aware of, that nearly 75% of the people in America are either obese or overweight. And so this still extends into the running community as well. So people are willing to be so disciplined and dedicated with their training. They'll get up at 4 in the morning and run in snow. And run in horrible conditions, and yet their dedication doesn't extend to their other habits. It's hard. It's hard in our society. Between 25 and 85, max heart rate decreases, and that's just intrinsic. And as the max heart rate goes down, we'll see that affects cardiac output. So we have a decrease in the pulmonary system, elasticity of the lungs. We don't have the same forced expiratory volume. The lungs, they're just not quite as elastic. Same thing with the we see in the heart, cardiorespiratory. We have an increase in ventilation rate because we don't get all the air out of the lungs. And with the residual volume. So you see that there's a lot of things that decrease during this time. Aerobic capacity, max heart rate, blood volume pump per heartbeat, because the ventricle is a little stiffer, and so it doesn't extract as strong as it did. And as soon as that happens, then the heart rate has to go up. We're breathing at a higher rate. We're working harder to get oxygen to the working muscles. The number of muscle fiber can decrease. And that's why it's so important for us to keep training. So cardiac output, max VO2, formula for that is cardiac output times peripheral oxygen extraction, the arterial venous difference. So not only do we have to pump the blood out, we've got to be able to extract the oxygen once it gets to the working muscle. Now, you see that one of the factors in determining cardiac output is heart rate. So if our max heart rate decreases, what's the formula for estimating max heart rate? 220 minus age. So age is a factor. So at age 22, my max heart rate when I was tested was about 204. Now to get to 174 is really difficult. So it's, we hope to. We don't want any obstacles. Primary factor, yes, for the max VO2 is the lower maximal heart rate. And stroke volume is affected by slower myocardial relaxation. And again, that has to do with the stiffness that occurs in the chambers. So physiological factors. The interesting thing, we've talked a lot about lactate threshold today, and that may even increase with aging. Because your VO2 may go down a bit, but because of heart rate, but with intense training, you can keep that lactate threshold high. That's the good news. If you keep training, so we find that lactate threshold as a percentage of VO2 for older runners is often higher than it is for younger runners. If they've trained intensely. So this is the trainable component. It's also why that tempo run, running at the pace that will stimulate the adaptation. That's what we started talking about today. It's still the key. You've got to have that stimulus that's going to bring about the adaptation. And you do this gradually, you do it smart, and you can get results. That's where the effective training plan comes back into play. Running economy, few data suggests that the actual cost of running changes. So that's really not a factor. Aging effects, often, we've already talked about, often it affects training intensity, recovery time, training volume, and body composition. But we're going to try to negate some of that. We're going to try to negate some of that. We're going to try to keep the body composition lean and strong. We're going to try to keep the intensity up. We might let the volume go down a little bit, but I think that's the key for the aging runners. Increased risk of injury, as you well know, the connective tissue is just not as elastic. It's more rigid. It loses some of its water. And it becomes less supple. It's not as supple, and thus it's more prone to becoming inflamed. And reduced stride length, of course, we've talked about. If you lose muscle mass, you're not as powerful. If you don't stretch, you lose flexibility. All of that affects stride length and ultimately your running speed. So the rate of performance decrement, we say it can expect 0.5 to 1% per year. We want it to be 0.5 rather than a full percent. So that's why training is so important. Now, if we look at data, if we look at the cross-sectional data, then what we see is that runners on the whole tend, the rate of decline tends to accelerate after 60, and probably every 5 years after that, after 65, after 70. Why is that? You know, is that physiological? Is that cultural? Is it psychological? I don't think we really know why that is. And perhaps the running literature will be rewritten by the boomers. And we're seeing that. And it's certainly happening with the females. You know, we're seeing a generation, several generations after post-Title IX now. And it's really changed what we're seeing in terms of performance. That 50 years ago, no one would say, well, a woman can't do that. Or they would say, an 80-year-old can't do that. But now we're seeing they can, because they've continued. In the past, it was thought, hey, you better not do that. You know, when I was growing up, you know, a 60-year-old better take it easy, because something's going to happen if they strain themselves. Or same thing we would hear about women. So it's kind of exciting. It's all being changed. Some of those changes started back in 1968 with the establishment of master athletics. And now there are the senior games. Maybe some of you have observed that. There are the senior games. Every state offers senior games. There's national senior games. There's international masters athletics. And so I know athletes who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s who are training for these competitions and traveling really internationally around the country to participate. So it's been an outlet. Sports are still available for the senior. I don't know if you're familiar with age-graded tables. I think they're pretty neat. These tables can be used to determine an athlete's performance level percentage. That is, you can look at your performance compared to the world best at that age, at that single age. So it's a way for you to compare yourself to yourself at different ages. I'll give you an example. So what we call is a performance level percentage of 60 is local class, 70 is regional class, 80 national class, and 90 is world class. So if you're 90% of the world record, you're a world class runner. If you're 80% of that, you're considered a national class runner. So here's an age-graded example. This is a 53-year-old male, runs a 3:05:30 marathon. That's an equivalent prime age performance of 2:45:17. You divide that by the world record for a 53-year-old, that 2:22:21 divided by the 3:05:30, and you get a performance level percentage of 76.7. Not quite national class, but pretty high regional class runner. So this runner can go back and compare and say, well, what was I running at age 35 when I was in my prime? Or you can compare your races every year over a 30 or 40 year span and say, have I kept my performance level percentage similar? Scott mentioned he just ran a marathon on Saturday, and he had very good performance. And I thought it was interesting. I always like to look at these performance level percentages. And Scott ran a 3:18 in his, and if you look for a 58-year-old, a 3:18 is 76+%. And if you look across his running over the years, generally he's been right around 76% at all distances, 77, occasionally 80, but you know, when he had a really great race. And also that 3:18 at age 58 was equivalent to a 2:46 at prime. Scott's performance at prime, 34, 35 years old, was 2:46. So he can look at that and take solace in the fact that a 3:18 is as good as a 2:46 was, knowing that there are these aging effects. So it's only the natural changes that occurred that are resulting in that slowing. So it's a good way for you to look. So I think the neat thing is not only can you compare yourself with your races of yesteryear, you can compare, and I use this with runners, just like we did with the goals, to look at their performance level percentage at different distances. And I can say, wow, you're a 78% performer at 5K and a 70% performer at marathons. So let's concentrate on the 5K. I mean, that obviously is where your talent lies. And it helps you determine what distance am I really best. It's neat stuff. I call it the fountain of youth. It provides you as an older person with a way of really looking at yourself and adjusting what's happened because of that. Back in 2001, my brother and I did a study. We looked at over 60,000 runner performances in Chicago and New York marathons and try to look at what's the effect of aging on marathon performance time. Is there a difference between females and males in terms of their performance decrement as they age? And what we found was aging is a strong predictor of marathon performance. We did regression equations and found that more than 80% of the increase in marathon finishing time was explained by age. And we looked at the top performers in each age group, assuming that these are people who are training seriously and have been doing it for a long time, and found that really, as you went from 40 to 50 to 60 to 70 performance, it almost could, it could be, most of it could be explained by age. Rate of performance accelerated for males and females after the age of 55. And I've already talked about that. Why is that? And might that change? It was greater for females than for males as they got older, that decline. My guess is this was data from 2000, and I bet that it has changed. And I would be interesting to go back and look at it now. We've got several generations of women who have now run into their 40s and 50s who are post Title IX. I say that because women born that were raised in the 40s and 50s were discouraged from exercising. Is getting slower inevitable? Yes. how can I minimize it, and should I minimize my training? So our studies reveal that runners' joints and bones are actually healthier than average. Runners who exercise vigorously are less likely to experience arthritis. Fitness really helps to maintain that peak performance. It helps to postpone premature aging. I told you there was a happy ending. We're going to postpone that. And so exercise capacity is a good predictor of mortality. So it's really important to do that. So how do you do it? We think that cross-training is important. We think stretching is important. We think strength training is important. And we certainly may believe that maintaining a healthy body weight is important so you can still be active. Less frequent training, but maintain that intensity. It doesn't have to be that much, but keep that intensity into the training.